Today we're going to have a bit of a engaging discussion. Hopefully, we can make it a little bit more interactive about the aspect of hope within caregiving. I will put out some definitions. We'll talk a little bit about the capacity of hope within caregiving, what it could be, what it might not be, how it flows, how it evolves, how it changes, and what have you, especially in the current unprecedented times. I was just talking to Judy about, there's a new term that might come out now that we might have just spoken about, is something called complicated hope. How does all the influences and evolution of our journey currently with the pandemic and the challenges of being a caregiver, how do they manifest in different aspects of hope, and how do those aspects of hope interlace or complicate or even sometimes negate one another? So we'll get into it a little bit today. Excuse me a second, folks. Our presentation isn't working. Oh, there we go. We'll make it work. A little bit of a background, folks. It's interesting. I've been doing a lot of webinars, including a provincial webinar in hospice palliative care, and there's always technical difficulties. So I'm sure we'll all make our way through it. Just to give you a little bit of a background on my story, folks. I am a cancer manager at the Second Mile Club of Kensington Health. My primary program is caregivers. I also honored to facilitate groups, caregiver support groups, Caregiver Connects at Wellspring and here at Kensington. But I also work right now as I've been redeployed into the hospice. We have a long-term care facility at Kensington, and we also have a 10-bed hospice. So I work a lot of bedside, serving residents who are living with us their last days, but I also support families in the community as their loved ones are at our hospice. And I also navigate the waters of bereavement and grief, but I also work in children's grief, Lighthouse for Grieving Children in Oakville. And just giving you this background just to maybe frame where my knowledge and understanding and awareness and work with caregivers has come from. I'm also a consultant. I teach and train across the province and country in hospice palliative care. But I think one of the most important pieces, folks, if I could bring this forth, is that I am personally a caregiver, both professionally, like I do this for a living, get paid for it. I can't believe people pay me to do this. But I also caregive for a father who's in palliative approach, who's palliative, and an older adult mother. So they live with me, and I'm a caregiver at work and a caregiver when I go home. So sometimes it's quite a challenge. And I believe most of you can relate. In the groups that I run, I hear a lot about not being able to take a break from caregiving. And let's see how the topic of hope can frame itself around that aspect. So I've been in hospice palliative care. These are just images that depict some of my journey in hospice to frame as well the caregiver and to frame the topic of hope within caregiving for somebody who has a life-limiting illness, in this case, with Wellspring in their capacity in cancer. I've worked for 15, 16 different hospices and across the province in terms of regulating bodies. And I've seen a lot of, I've seen a lot of life-limiting illnesses. I've companioning a lot of death, a lot of dying, more accurately. And I've seen how the capacity of the caregiver is becoming, respectfully to all of you and sensitively, more taxed, let alone in a pandemic. The caregiver is expected to do more and more. The informal, meaning the people who don't get paid to do this, are being even more and more tasked as caregivers to support loved ones at home. It could be due to how the healthcare funding is. It could be due to what I see is the lack of capacity within settings. It could be the expectation. It could be our own expectation. It could be also the generational gap. Older adults are living longer, and as such, might require more care at home. Care in a long-term care facility can be expensive. Not many of us can afford it. We have a very large immigrant refugee population who are not necessarily like my family. My father says to me, "You're going to put me where?" And I said, "No, absolutely. I'll keep you at home," because in our culture, in many cultures in Canada, because we are so diverse in this capacity, is to care for our older adults at home. And that's assuming older adults. There's working with Lighthouse for Grieving Children, I see a lot of younger adults and children who become caregivers. We call it young carers programs, where caregiving is not just restricted to caring for older adults, but it's caring for anybody in the trajectory of a life-limiting illness such as cancer. It's quite a capacity, to be a caregiver. If there's capes, if anybody's here, my daughter, she saw a signpost the other day. She goes, "Daddy, you're a hero. You're an essential worker." I said, "No, honey. Caregivers are heroes in my mind. Caregivers, in general, are heroes." A lot of my work also, folks, has been on the streets of Toronto, working with people who are experiencing structural vulnerability or homelessness. And man, oh man, the topic of hope and the definition of hope is, how can I say it without being too dramatic, is incredibly unique on the streets. Um, how it's defined, how it's experienced, what people are hopeful living in such conditions is quite remarkable. And those who care for them, meaning, street families who care for people who are also living on the street, and that caregiving capacity, what each defines as hopeful. We should have a whole session, maybe not with Wellspring, but we should have a whole session on what hope looks like on the streets of Toronto. But I ask you folks, as we traverse this webinar, this session, I ask you just to I welcome you to put forth, what are some of the things that you find hopeful? How do you define hope? Or even just keep them in the back of your mind as I speak and as we engage. How do you define hope? Where do you see it? What do you find lacking hope, or what you perceive to lack hope? And we'll mash it up a little bit, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, in all honesty, when it comes to um, the whole topic of hope. I'm gonna give you a textbook definition of it, and it's so interesting that when we, how can I say, put boundaries on it and lose the humanity in it and the uniqueness of it, that it becomes a cookie cutter. And in my work, folks, working with people who are living with a life-limiting illness, hope is so incredibly unique. It's as unique as a person. I mean, I don't know if you can actually really define it until you ask somebody how they define it and how they feel about it and what they think of it. And not just that, what I've seen in the trajectory of illness, right, anywhere from days to months to years, is how it changes. I mean, I sit with people at bedside all the time, every day, and one day they're hopeful. Let's even change it. Let's take it out of even the term hope, and let's make it real. Sometimes they just want to see the next morning, or they want to smell the flowers, or they want their pain to go away, or they want a miracle, or they want a cure, or they want to see their families, right? It could change momentarily. And I'll speak a little bit to the malleability and the nimbleness of that state that we call hope, and how it can change quickly. But I really think it's misunderstood. I think I see a lot in my work, when somebody is uh, hoping for something, it's can be oftentimes denounced, or restricted, or vilified. What can you possibly be hoped for? Why are you hoping for that? But what's important, folks, isn't so much what we are hopeful for, but the fact that we are, right? We are in that autonomy and self-direction of holding an emotion and having acknowledged. A lot of my work is just acknowledging the feeling that we would classify as being hopeful for this or for that. The acknowledgement piece is what I find caregivers, unfortunately, um, don't receive enough. They starve of it. Um, I mean, a lot of caregivers don't even have the capacity to have somebody listen to them, let alone acknowledge, let alone a pandemic on top of that. That's why I'm so appreciative of the Wellspring program, because they give an avenue, a setting, a platform with which caregivers can have their feelings acknowledged. But so often this feeling, however you define hope, is unacknowledged or seen as irrational, right? Or it's so the reality is so stark that they can't even harbor this emotion. So I think the topic of hope is very much misunderstood and journeys of life-limiting illness, and especially in cancer. So I want to put out there a definition of hope. The internet is just fantastic. Obviously, I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but for all that you could find in defining and definitions and characterizations, you could find anything on there. But there's a lot of misleading information, and that's why in the work that I do in hospice palliative care, we're so focused on the uniqueness and individuality of anything that comes out of a resident's or a caregiver's thoughts. But here, let me give you a definition. The worldofdictionary.com. I'll read it to you. Hope is an optimistic state of mind that is based on an expectation of positive outcomes with respect to events and circumstances in one's life or the world at large. I wonder, I'm not sure if anybody would be able to venture. How many people agree? And what part of that do you agree on? Or because I don't necessarily agree with that statement. Although when you ask anybody on the street or maybe friends and families, how do you define hope? It's always positive, it's always optimistic, and it's always relevant to events and circumstances, especially circumstances. But does it necessarily have to be characterized and conditioned as optimistic? Could it be just something that somebody wants to happen and not put it as, because if there's optimistic and there's positive, then there's the polar opposite of negative and pessimistic, right? But what happens to holding, and uh, that's why many times I hear caregivers don't dare talk about what they're hopeful for fear that it would be thought of as either pessimistic, optimistic, negative, positive. Somebody will condition it, or we'll do it to ourselves, saying, I'm hopeful for this, but it's wrong or it's bad. Or I'm hopeful for this, but it's not optimistic enough, or it's not positive enough. So not only do we characterize it and condition it, we put a measure on it, right? And I don't believe hope is like that. Hope oscillates, hope fluctuates, hope changes in terms of how it's felt and the depth with which it's felt. And the attachment to outcomes. Yeah, there could be a continuum to an outcome. There could be an attachment to an outcome with hope, right? But sometimes it doesn't have to have necessarily an outcome, meaning something that's going to happen, right? When I work with caregivers and people living with a life-limiting illness, especially at bedside, it's just the acknowledgement and autonomy of having the emotion, right? If we put the outcome in there, we start to focus on the possibility of the outcome not happening. So let's be real with it. Let's put it right out there. Somebody who's hopeful for their cancer to go away. Somebody who's a caregiver that's hopeful for their cancer to go into remission may not put the emphasis on it for fear that the outcome may not happen. So the emotion, the feeling of it is lost. It becomes suppressed or repressed, and that's not vocalized, not acknowledged. Right? And that moment can be lost. And sometimes that's a moment lost between a caregiver and the person they're caring for, because their definitions of hope can be in two different places. I remember, without breaking too much confidence, I'll tell you a few snippets. I remember because I facilitate caregiver groups, one individual, and they had their spouse, their cancer had stabilized, not necessarily remission, but it wasn't advancing, right? And that the person living with the cancer was hopeful that it might end up going away. The caregiver, having also that sense of hope, wouldn't allow themselves to feel it because of the attachment to an outcome that it might actually come back. And around her family, they kept reminding her, saying, "Don't get too hope. Don't get your hopes up." How many of you heard that as caregivers? Don't get your hopes up, right? When in fact, I should have put a slide here about the brain and the nervous system. Just the thought of something that brings you some measure of relief, comfort, peace, even joy, can release endorphins in our bodies, can release um, uh, not adrenaline, but can release hormones that allow us to feel just a state of what's called decompensation of emotions. So oftentimes when we're caregivers, we live in, and I spoke to this in a few webinars ago, in a state of hyperarousal or hypoarousal, where we're jacked up, right? We're in fight or flight because we're constantly on, we're constantly trying to care for a loved one. To have an emotion, to entertain it, to hold it, such as hope, right, can actually lower that fight or flight and release stress. But then if you can't acknowledge it, or it's not permission to acknowledge it or come to terms with it or even hold it, then that's an avenue with which caregivers can't necessarily decompensate and de-stress. You might have heard these terms too. I'm getting a little technical here. I won't get too technical into the definitions, but just what's called false hope. And what have you heard? What's false hope? I mean, I could tell you what I've heard, but what possibly have you heard as false hope? That somebody at, um, that has stage 4, that has weeks to days to live, is hoping for or is feeling for something that will, that they will survive. So, folks, when I work in hospice palliative care, we never try to steer somebody away from the sense of what they feel. What somebody feels is an important piece in how they have self-perception. And then in June, we're going to talk a little bit about traumatization, that the trauma of a diagnosis of cancer, especially by the witnessing of the witnessing by a caregiver, can be very traumatizing. So it's not so much the falseness of it, it's the acknowledgement of the emotion, almost without the reference point of what is termed reality. And I'm not going to talk about people walking out of a hospice. I've in terms of living through their illness and walking away. That's a whole different other subject. But it's just the capacity. Yes.
Can I jump in with we have a question from one of
Sure.
the
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
participants. Do
Sure.
you mind if I
Okay.
jump in?
Not at all.
Wishful thinking about things out of our control seems like it might be a waste of energy to me. Could you comment on that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I've heard that sometimes from caregivers. So when I sit with somebody and they have a wishful thinking, all right, I try to go behind the thinking, the wishfulness of it. What's behind it? What are they? Because what it does, folks, the wishfulness leads to something called loss and grief. So what that which they're wishing for is in direct opposition of that which is happening sometimes. And in that is a way to bring somebody around or help somebody acknowledge the feeling that is creating the wishfulness, right? And when we're able to access that, sometimes it changes how the person feels about that which they're wishing for. I'll give you an example. The gentleman I used to sit with quite a bit, he would say to me, I just wish the Leafs would win the Stanley Cup. I just wish the Leafs would win the Stanley Cup. And he was dying of cancer, pancreatic cancer. What we sat and when I explored the whole wishing of some outcome or event, right, wasn't wasting time at all. It was a way for him to process that which he was going to lose and never see again, right? The Oftentimes we denounce the wishfulness of it and we fluff it off and we dismiss it, but there's an emotion creating it, right? And that emotion that's creating it is sometimes hidden behind the perception of what we're wishing for. And that can lead to what's called anticipatory grief. That can lead to um, an understanding of what they're truly hopeful for. Right? I'm very careful with what people classify and who's classifying the wishfulness. Sometimes the wish is is just as important in terms of a sense of validation, because they could be wishing for this because they recognize they're losing this, and that would lead to a loss of sense of self. And that sense of self or sense of memory or sense of legacy or whatever they're losing is compensated for by wishing for it or wishing for the other outcome. It's a very important segue in there to explore emotions within that. I hope that helps. You're more than welcome to ask more questions on that. Then we can classify something as having no hope, right? When somebody is, especially caregivers, when they see an outcome that has no hope, right? And I explore that in myself. A lot of people are exploring it now with the pandemic, and some are exploring it in terms of their loved one's journey with cancer. What is the no? What is that? Is it in the situation that is being classified as absent, completely absent, right? With those, uh, it's not necessarily hopelessness, but there's no hope whatsoever. I think there's a difference between hopelessness and no hope, because no hope sometimes leads to a lack of empowerment, a lack of autonomy, a feeling, a loss of control. So that says, how can I have hope? There's no hope in this, but underlying that is a lack of, it's a feeling of a disempowerment or a lack of autonomy or not being able to control the situation. Right? It's classified as not having hope, when in fact, what we could address, what we look at in ourselves and people we care for, is the lack of what the situation is causing in terms of lack of empowerment. And lost hope, right? Lost hope implies that there was hope at one time and then we lost it. Okay. If you listen to the lost part, there's what's important there isn't so much the hope piece, but the grief in the loss. The loss of the hope is what I would focus on, is what I support, is listening to not so much what the hope was, but the experience of the loss. But where we sometimes get stuck is, the hope piece. They lost hope, when in fact it's an expression of grief. It's an expression of loss, and in that which was being hopeful. Oh, look at that title comes in afterward. Anyways, and then real hope. I've heard this in caregiving quite a bit. We define real hope in terms of reality. What's reality? Well, they look at outcomes, they look at prognosis, they look at stats, they look at pathology, they look at capacity of what they can do, and they define it as what's real. So if there's something that's real, then it begs to ask, is there something that's false, right? Which speaks to before. But it's a perception, really. When we talk about real hope, the reality of it is perceptive. And what I work with a lot with caregivers is we look at how to define the reality of it. And I saw this a lot on the streets of Toronto, folks, in terms of what real hope is. And it came down to a perception. What are you perceiving as being real? And so much of our perception is misperception, right? Of their situation, of our experience. And if you take a misperception of a situation, especially as a caregiver, and you add on top of that to be hopeful for something, then sometimes we get into what could be a little bit complicated in terms of the emotion of hope and the perception of the situation. And what we do a lot in caregiver support groups, especially even at Wellspring, is to help caregivers. That's why I like it being interactive. Just process and sift through what they're perceiving as real and what they're perceiving as a misperception, misperception of the situation in front of them, and a misperception of themselves. And one of the most common misperceptions, folks, that actually erodes any emotion or aspect of hope is by caregivers is the misperception that they are not doing enough, right? And when that is across the board, the misperception is that we're not doing enough, and then that erodes any even autonomy or self-direction um, in the self-generation of hope. I think we have a few more questions or engagements, Judy.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Please elaborate. Why is trauma associated with misperception of reality? I feel like I'm perceiving just fine.
Could be, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. There's not. This is very individual. Trauma is even a misconception in itself. So I'll give you an example. Somebody who's caregiving for a loved one who has cancer, the constant fight or flight can leave the mind, okay, in a state of hypervigilance and hyperarousal, and and then recognize that their environment is very threatening. Okay, we see that in hospice a lot. We see it with caregivers a lot. But in other cases, folks, no, it's not traumatizing. Trauma is very unique in terms of when it comes to our personhood. And no, not necessarily. You could be perceiving just fine. I'm not in any way going to take that away from anybody. but it's self-reflective, right? I've worked with many caregivers and people living with a life-limiting illness that what they I'll give you an example. We had a family who came to the hospice and they felt it, although there was lots of compassion and empathy and support, they felt it was very threatening because a history of trauma led the individual to feel that nothing is safe, even when they're being cared for by the utmost compassion and care. That's the interesting piece of traumatization, is that sometimes it can create a perception that we don't even know is being misperceived in the external environment. What we see is not necessarily what is. But only person that can really, really define that is in their feelings is someone like yourself, no doubt. Yeah, agreed. We had another question, Vicky. Judy, sorry, I was working with Vicky.
That's it right now.
All right. Okay. Let's expand a little bit on hope and the vocabulary of hope. Did you know the vocabulary of hope is actually classified as a noun and a verb? So hope can actually be um, a noun, a thing, right? It can actually be a verb, meaning it's an action. And I've seen this in the work that we do, and I veer more to hope being a verb, meaning it can change, it can move, it can evolve, it can morph, right? It's actually not necessarily a static thing. Circumstances in a journey, circumstances in an experience can cause hope to expand and contract, or the feeling of hope to expand and contract. What I've come to also to recognize is that the subject of hope, the topic, the verb of hope, and I'm building this up so that we actually get into what it is in a little bit, can change, folks. So it's very hard to necessarily classify it as anything more than a state, right? Kind of like a feeling, a state, a mindset of of where we are and what we're perceiving. It can change. I've seen individuals and caregivers have their experience of what we classify as hope change in an instant, um, depending on how they're feeling, depending on the state of the loved one, depending on news they hear, or sometimes that doesn't have to be anything external that changes that feeling. It can be almost self-generated, right? It can be self-generated in the sense that a thought or an apprehension or a fear or an excitation can generate a perception, a feeling that is different from moment to moment. Right? And I advocate very strongly with caregivers to be very mindful of how they feel, not necessarily moment to moment, and there's that mindfulness word, but how their emotions can ebb and flow with respect to what they're hopeful for when it expands and what causes it to expand, and what they might not be hopeful as they see it contract. What I mean by expand, where it takes up a lot more of their mind and their hearts, and when it contracts, when it actually becomes um, not so strong, not so prevalent, not so in their minds and in their hearts. I find hope to be fluid. Right? I see hopeful, the sense of hope, or what we're hopeful for, or what we um, what we experience as fluidity. A lot in caregiver groups, what we talk about is that fluidity of emotion. It will ebb and flow. Somebody asked about trauma. I think the whole aspect of trauma, which we'll talk about in June, um, caregiving for somebody is oftentimes traumatizing. And what I mean by traumatizing, it just overall, I mean, trauma in itself has a very negative connotation. All trauma is that something that overwhelms our emotions, our minds, our ability to cope. And I've rarely come across, could be people in the audience, I've rarely come across a caregiver who is not overwhelmed by their caregiving roles. Certainly the ones that come to our groups are extremely overwhelmed. And 80% of Canadians have experienced some aspect of traumatization. Now with the pandemic, we add that. I mean, it's closer to 100%. And that feeling of feeling overwhelmed. And why I bring that to light, why I think that's an important piece, is that sometimes that affects what we permission ourselves or allow ourselves to be hopeful for. And sometimes, folks, it's unconscious, right? the whole being overwhelmed as a caregiver, we could take out the word trauma now. We want to expand on that next month. The whole aspect of being overwhelmed as a caregiver can actually suppress and repress any aspects of hope, or from our environment, our family, and even sometimes, to be perfectly honest, from support staff, right? That how their demeanors and how their thoughts and their thinking and their perceptions of the journey can override somebody's aspect of being hopeful, right? Regardless of what the experience really is, regardless of what the reality is, I think it's important to hold that emotion of whatever it may be inside somebody and acknowledge it. And acknowledge it because it also can be a segue to the experience of grief. So, folks, what I'm really characterizing this is that these are avenues with which we can have self-expression and being in touch with emotional experiences. And sometimes if we block one or we dilute one, it actually transcends to all of them. It's a skill set to be able to touch on emotion, to be able to access emotion, especially in the crisis of sometimes of caregivers or caregiving. And whether it's the verb of hopefulness, to be hopeful, to hope for something, or to experience the loss of that which we were hoping for, the emotion is there. It's the accessibility of that emotion that's really, really important. So when I work with in caregiver groups and what have you, the the acknowledgement and the self-awareness of any emotion that comes out is paramount. It's paramount in that regard because it allows it to access other emotions that sometimes are very fluid. So we can move from being hopeful for something, and that could be an accessibility to grief, or we can experience grief, which brings a new sense of hope for a different future or a different journey. If the fluidity of their emotional expression is there, then the caregiver can move and not get stuck in feeling overwhelmed with a particular exasperation of emotion. What I see with caregivers very often is the precipitation of these two emotions, the movement of these two emotions. Oftentimes, hope oscillates with fear. And I ask you, do you ever see it, how they oscillate? And I ask caregivers just to be mindful of one because it usually is connected to the other. Hopeful for something can lead to the fear of its loss. The fear of its loss can sometimes be processed and be hopeful for something else, which can lead to another experience of recognition or awareness of loss. And that oscillation between hope and fear is very, very common. We can hope for remission, or we can hope for the pain to subside, and then we can fear that which it won't happen. And again, it's the all-encompassing experience of the emotion. That's what I find is very important, is to recognize both emotions there and how, almost like an observer, to watch them like a dance between each other. And if we sit with caregivers, when I sit with caregivers, their emotions flow as such, or we try to create an empowerment or an environment where their emotions can flip, can move, can go from feeling hopeful about something, to being afraid of that which it won't happen, and then back to being hopeful about it, because one can lead to the other. And then there could be a sense of loss and grief in that, but then there could be hopeful for a regeneration, and this could happen in minutes, in days, and months. It's that fluidity of emotion as caregivers that I find is paramount in navigating the stress of being a caregiver. If there isn't so much of that fluidity of motion, of expression, yes.
Uh, I'm sorry
No, you
to
don't have
interrupt
to
you on a
apologize.
roll around. We have another comment
Sure.
about not fear but despair.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I put fear in there um, because it's the most common that I feel. I see with caregivers. But you're absolutely right, and I appreciate you put that out there, because you can make a list of emotions: fear, despair, apathy, helplessness. all those emotions can be there at the same time, or in different degrees of potency. Uh, and they could feed one another. But what I'm mindful with caregivers is that sometimes when those are explored or held, sometimes a thread of hope can come out of that if they so self-directed, if they so go there, or the opposite. Sometimes somebody can be, I've sat with caregivers who were expressing so much hope for something, and then all of a sudden it led to a despair. Okay, I'll give you an example. One caregiver I was supporting, they were uh, hopeful that it would end, that they would be free of the caregiving role. Let's be real. So, I mean, in all honesty, folks, I personally have experienced this myself. Be free of the caregiving role. They'd be free from the tax and the pain and the appointments and constantly being on. And they were just done, and they felt a little guilty saying, I just wish this would end, meaning that the person would die. But the hope was that this piece of it, this piece of my suffering as a caregiver would end. And then the despair hit. Do you know what the despair was? That they'd be alone. Do you see how they can go hand in hand and move? So somebody can be, hoping or hopeful, or in a place where this can all dissipate because I can't do it anymore. And at the exact same time, or in a segue, to feel the sense and depth of despair, because they recognized in what they're hopeful for, they are going to lose something. They're going to be alone. They're going to be on their own. They're going to have to deal with all the issues, all the challenges of their life on their own. However, if we're focused on one and categorizing one without the other, then or don't allow the segue to the other or support the segue to the other, where does that leave the person? Right? Where does that leave the caregiver? Another piece is that when a person as such as a caregiver is hoping for this outcome, there's a is that a positive optimistic end, positive optimistic outcome? Well, the outcome is that their loved one would die so that they're not suffering anymore. So there's an outcome, a positive outcome that they're not suffering anymore, and the fact that the loved one dies. So that's where I find it's important just to categorize hope as whatever it is the person is feeling and acknowledging it, and how it can move to another aspect. And we just saw it there, gone from hopeful that her suffering would end as a caregiver to despair that she'd be completely alone. Any more questions, Judy? I like these questions. They're very powerful, very, very important.
Um, oh, we're just hearing that Rami's camera has turned off. I can see you. Oh, it's back on again. Great. Yep. So we don't have any more questions for you yet, Rami. I'll keep
Okay.
jumping in.
Okay. Thank you very anytime. Just interrupt me. All right. Okay. And what I try to support with caregivers, and even in myself, is to hold what I call polarities, folks. Um, we can be hopeful of something. We can have a um, kind of like a perception, a want, a feeling towards something, and hold at the same time its polar opposite. And oftentimes, hope, like somebody mentioned, wishful thinking, right? We can hold that piece of saying, I want this to happen. But at the same time, if we look at that, we might actually feel this happening. Oftentimes, a caregiver support, or what I ask caregivers to do, is to look at all the emotions and thoughts around a particular hope. That's when hope can be a noun, right? When it's a thing. If you look at if we look at all that emotion around there, all the thoughts around it, we start to be able to identify all the aspects associated with that particular hope as a noun. And then hope can turn into a verb. And what I mean by that, then the hope almost starts to be attributed to different aspects of that which we're perceiving. Let me give you an example. I work very well with examples. Okay, the gentleman that was wishing for the Stanley Cup, at least to win the Stanley Cup, which is never going to happen anyways, but that's another topic. That's a grief in all itself. Part of that hopefulness, or that which we was hopeful for, was the grief when we looked at it, that he wasn't going to see it, or the fact that he might not be there, okay, or the fact that his family wouldn't necessarily be there to bear witness to it, or that he wouldn't be part of the parade as he spoke, right? His wishful thinking, which his family would constantly tell him, get this, his family would constantly tell him, right, was that he would never see it. He would never be a part of it. And his caregiver, which was his son, okay, watched this and started to enact supports so that his father wouldn't necessarily lose hope, right? Have no hope. But what happened there is that when the caregiver, which was the son, started to look at what was really going on within themselves, they had what would be classified, had lost hope. Not that his father wouldn't see or live long enough, okay? He had lost hope that the father wouldn't be able to come to terms with the fact that he wouldn't see it. So that's sometimes where it's classified as false hope. What's important, folks, is, especially in this circumstance, is to recognize what is it that we're feeling with respect to a situation? What is it we're projecting onto someone else? Especially when it comes to the aspect of hope. And what are we fostering in the person just as emotional expression to see what's around it and what's with it? Okay. When I stepped in and supported this family, I would sit with, let's just call him Joe. I would just sit with Joe and we'd talk about the Leafs winning the Stanley Cup, right? That's what was important to him. We really got into it, was the fact that he could at least talk about it and be with it. And then when I sat with the son, his idea of hope was very different from what he was projecting onto his father, which the fact was that his father would have a peaceful death, that he would come to terms with it. That's what he was, and they were completely missing one another. Oftentimes in caregiver roles, caregivers' definition or perception of hope is very different from that the person they are caring for. Do you agree? I mean, you are caregivers. Like, if you agree or you don't agree, please put out some questions, put out some engagements. Let's see what you think. This is what I see. This is what I've seen in 30 years of this field. Is this mismatch, right? And then sometimes one will put it on the other, and either it's received or it's not received, or it's recognized, and it could cause discord between the two as they're not able to hold that which they're feeling. I like this picture, folks. I don't know if you can see it, if the camera's still on, Judy. I hope so. Um, and what I want to segue into is some of the things that are expressed or hoped for, what I see in the field a lot, especially as a caregiver. And look at the emotions, folks, that are involved almost as a polar opposite, or that could come and accompany that emotion. So I've heard from caregivers that they were hopeful for. Now, now recognize this? Is this a positive, optimistic outcome, as that definition said? Is that their loved one would suffer less. Now, what does that really mean? Like, what's the aspect in that they are going to die, that their pain would be managed? Is pain and suffering the same thing? Or is it that the caregiver is having like, see this, is it that they're hoping out of compassion and empathy that their loved one would suffer less? Or is it the caregiver hoping for themselves not to bear witness to suffering of their loved one, which is very hard, right? I've heard many times, of course, hope for a miracle, hope for a cure, hope for this to completely go away. And when I sit with caregivers and we explore that piece, folks, I've heard it many times. Oh, don't talk to them about that. Don't, they're dying. They're stage 4. They're knocking on death's door. Don't talk to them about the miracle, right? But why not? Why not, if it's something that brings them some aspect of emotional expression? And I've sat with people. I said, well, tell me about this, and we hash it out. We talk about it, and sometimes it leads to, the piece that is attached to that which they're hopeful for, right? And as caregivers, sometimes that piece is not necessarily what we think it is. And I'll give you an example. One gentleman, he was caring for his wife. He was hoping for a miracle for his wife. His wife was done. She was happy to move on. She had suffered a lot. And when we sat and we talked about it, was the fact that he had just worried. You know what it was? What he was hoping for in terms of miracle was the fact that as a caregiver, he just didn't want to be alone. Look how, and then the despair hit. Look how the sense of hope was tied into actually something very deeply personal for him, which was being alone, being in despair, not knowing how to cope without her. But at the same time, and not the polar opposite, but the polarity of it was something that he was hopeful for. And I think that's important for us to recognize as caregivers, folks, because most of our loved ones, maybe not most, but a large portion of them, um, may not survive the illness, right? And that which we're hopeful for in this moment may change the next moment. And what we're important as caregivers to be mindful of is the experience of the grief, loss, despair that's associated with the same time as being hopeful for something.
Amy, can I jump in here for a second
Sure,
with another question?
sure.
The question is, I'm reacting very negatively to all the talk about hoping for a peaceful death. You'd have to be a monster not to, but it will be what it will be. I can't fix control it, and there was pain before last days.
I forgive me. I hope I don't sound insensitive. I love that you brought that up. I love that you brought that up. I mean, I work in hospice. I've been in it for 30 years. What is a peaceful death, right? Is it, and let's expand it a little bit more. Can we go to this topic? What's a good death? What's a bad death? If you have a good death, is it necessarily a bad death, right? Is it, is what one person classifies as peaceful, another person classifies as horrific? I think it's what I heard from you, and what I think is important is how you autonomously said, "I'm sick of this," right? And that's the piece that's important. Respectfully, I get tired of hearing it too. Let's push for a peaceful death. Let's push for this. Let's push for this. Respectfully, and I hope I'm speaking to what you asked. Sometimes it's shitty. Sometimes it's hard. But what I hope for, folks, is that I hope for in my work and in my family is that I hope that I can hold whatever is being presented to me in its unconditionality. If it's bad, as I perceive it, then I hope I can hold it. If it's peaceful, I hope I can hold it. The peace for me is being able to be present with whatever it is, however it looks, you know, and not necessarily to categorize that what could be uh, classified as peacefulness. So I work in hospice. I've worked in end of life for so long, folks. I can't tell you how often I've heard um, the push for whatever somebody else perceives as peacefulness or peace. I hope that answered your question. Some other things I've heard we are hoped for, and just what I ask you in these topics is just to be mindful of the collateral emotions. I hope for time, right? I hope for a certain amount of time. I've heard that very often. And what sometimes is associated with that is the anxiousness that time is running out, right? I hope to have more time, but to acknowledge that time is passing, right? Those emotions go hand in hand. Um, I hope this is peace, and I love that you brought that up. Absolutely. And how do you classify peace? Why I put that in there is because I'm tired of always it being the focus in death. I hope that the person will be able to, either the caregiver or the person to clarify, classify, characterize what they define as peace, right? Or what they define as a peaceful death. I've seen, you know, um, a multitude of deaths, but I would never classify any of them or push any of them to be peaceful. The peace as a caregiver for me is to be what I really appreciate Carl Rogers saying is unconditional positive regard to what I see in front of me as a caregiver. That's my peace, to be grounded and to be with it and to be um, supportive as much as possible as it is. That brings me peace. And it could be, I've sat with people, folks that, as a caregiver, as even in family and friends, where they were moaning and screaming and yelling and not wanting to die right up until the end. There may not be peace for that person in that, but it's as a caregiver to be present with it, to recognize how it affects me, how it makes me feel, to be mindful of it, because that's what ends up in what we call traumatization, overwhelming the nervous system, is we're not able to acknowledge it and be with it. I've heard from caregivers, I wish he would die, right? Imagine that. Is that an optimistic, positive outcome? Well, if you hold it and really look at what that hope is, it in some characterizes it might be a sense of relief of suffering for the caregiver. And many caregivers, folks, might not admit, but I've heard them in the privacy of our conversations, and sometimes, in the group, is that they hope the suffering would end by the person dying, so that they don't have to bear witness to it anymore. They can't give as much anymore. They can't do as much for the person anymore. But that's still a hope, is it not? Right? But would you classify it as a positive, optimistic outcome? I don't know. Depends what that's when perception comes in. Depends who's bearing witness to that, who's listening, who's holding judgment to that. The hope for more support. I hear so much from caregivers now is that they have so little supports in the homes because of COVID, right? To have more support, which also could mean that there's a feeling of lack of support, right? And that's where I play, folks, with caregivers, and that's what I play with myself. That which I'm hopeful for, or that's what I want, or I perceive to be beneficial, or however you define it, has also a lack in it, a possible lack in it, a possible uh, vacancy in it. And I'm mindful for both those emotions. A hope for a different future. A lot of us are thinking that right now with the pandemic in different ways, right? As a caregiver, I look at, and especially with my family, is that I hope for a future for myself, um, without necessarily I'll be straight up with you. My parents aren't watching this. I hope for a future where the tax and the load and the pressure is not there anymore. However that looks like, because it's very difficult for me, especially caring for two older adults and one that's palliative. To tie in the death piece, I hope for an end, right? To hope for an end. An end of what, though? And I've asked caregivers this: what would be the end? Well, I can't tell you, Ram. I don't. Well, what is it? It says, I just want this all to stop. However it is, I just hope it would stop, right? So what they were hoping for is associated with all that is hurting them, taxing them, um, causing them struggle. I never forget this one individual, and I was sitting with her, and as a caregiver, she was watching her mother die, and she said, "I hope just for a moment." And what was the moment? I said, "What was the moment?" She says, "Just a moment where I can take it all in and hold it and be here present." And her experience as a caregiver was remarkable in that regard, because she felt that the dying of her mom, which wasn't that advanced in age, was the fact that it brought her to a sense of centeredness and groundedness and presence, because it was so stark, so real. It certainly wasn't a quote unquote peaceful death, but she was hoping just for a moment where she felt very present. I hear a lot from caregivers is a hope that they'll learn something from this. A hope that they are learning something from this, which sometimes, if you look at it, there could be a feeling that they don't know enough. And with cancer diagnoses, prognosis, death, and dying, um, sometimes, not in every case, sometimes the more we know, okay, in terms of the process, what's happening, um, it can lower the sense of anxiety. It can also increase the sense of anxiety. But for people who are hopeful that they will learn more about themselves, they'll learn more about the person they're caring for. Sometimes the authenticity I've seen many times in supporting couples with uh, uh, one individual living with a life-limiting illness or cancer, is that they learn even more about themselves, right? In that learning, there's a hopefulness that they will dive deeper into themselves or into the relationship. Sometimes the hope that I hear from caregivers, folks, is the hope to understand, why is this happening? Why did this happen? Why did this happen to my child, or to my loved one, or to me as a caregiver? What have I done? I've been good all my life. I've cared for people, and now, I'm about to retire, or my child is about to go to school. I have some time, or why did this happen? What I hope I understand one day what this happened, and explore that a little bit, is the fact that maybe there's the questions themselves become important, right? It's not just what we're hoping for. And that's, I find that sometimes, folks, that's a segue into ourselves, is that that which we're hoping for can spawn questions that can be embraced, held, not necessarily answered, but at least given acknowledgement and awareness. I just read these slides to you folks because I think I bring them from hospice palliative care, and I feel the whole topic of hope as a noun, as a verb, plays into these. I find maybe I should have taken out the word must. I appreciate, or I advocate, or I support the acknowledgement. And the complex, meaning especially now, it's very complex in terms of how hope and grief and despair and joy all can mix into one another, and complicate and convolute sometimes if we're not really necessarily paying attention to those emotions. And the dynamic nature, what does dynamic mean? Dynamic means changing, right? That which we can hope for today can change tomorrow, can change the day after. It could change moment to moment, even as we caregive or as we live with a life-limiting illness. And there it says it all. It changes during illness. The journey of a life-limiting illness such as cancer, as you folks already know, can be very unstable, can be dynamic, it can be changing. And I don't mean just the pathology and the prognosis of the disease. I mean the emotional experience. There's something about having something in our bodies that can elicit a lot of emotion, a lot of thoughts, if it's given permission and space. Yeah, I think there's a lot of ingredients to life and what have you. But very importantly, folks, is that even the subject of hope is very unique. That's why you can't quite classify it and call it optimistic or positive or what have you. It's just unique to the person. What I advocate with caregivers is to look not just at what they're hopeful for, but what is it coming from? Hope is usually a look, a projected look, right, into a future and a direction, but it's coming from somewhere. It could be a lack, it could be a fear, it could be a despair, it could be a loss. They go hand in hand, oftentimes. And sometimes, I don't quite believe in the word denial, folks, right? And the reason I know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did a lot of work on it, but she'd be rolling over in her grave if she knew what we had done to it in terms of classifying as a stage of grief, because it's fluid and it's movement. Same thing with hope. I don't necessarily believe in the word denial, because if you and because sometimes denials is associated with hope, like false hope or frivolous hope or wishful thinking. But what's important is, what is the person feeling in that moment as a caregiver or as somebody who's living with a life-limiting illness such as cancer? Man, that's a mouthful. Just trying to be encompassing. What is the person feeling that's precipitating that that perception, that thought, that want? And are we creating enough permission, especially as caregivers sitting with loved ones? Are we creating enough permission and safety to see what's behind it? Do we see what's underneath it? See what's convoluted with it, right? Because sometimes, if if uh, if we don't feel safe enough as caregivers, we appear to others that we're denying what's actually happening in the moment, rather than um, just not feeling safe enough to talk about it. And I see that very common with hope or expressions of hope. Sometimes caregivers won't dare tell anybody else what they're feeling because it'll get squashed or dismissed or thought of as wishful thinking. But in fact, there's a lot of emotions associated with it that's precipitating this uh, one piece. It can be. It can be. Not always. It can be experienced or expressed as joy. But what's important piece of that, folks, isn't so much the joy, because it's not necessarily joy. It can be release of endorphins. It's the measurement, right? Hope has a capacity to oscillate, to expand and contract, and have a potency to it, meaning a strength, right? And some days it can be very big and large and take up space in our hearts and minds, and sometimes it can collapse and contract on itself. And sometimes it can go minuscule until something brings along and creates the permission or safety or space for it to expand again. And this is possible. I've seen it often with caregivers before, in the journey of cancer or after the loved one has died of cancer. Sometimes the capacity can help us to redefine our lives, right? And change. But the capacity really is in recognizing and the kind of like the self-awareness of that which we are feeling as characterized by hope. I'll give you an example. Somebody we're supporting in one of the groups. Um, they're at despair. They're in anxiety in terms of what their life would look like before their spouse died, and then their spouse died, and they drew on that despair because at the same time as they were experiencing the despair, they were looking to the future and trying to perceive what their life would look like. Now just play with me for a second. Let me just play this out for you. As they were trying to see what their life would look like, a sliver of hope came out that they might be okay. And then she went back to despair. Fast forward to after the spouse died, that sliver, that seed is somehow on her own, and with some support, has germinated because somehow she looked at the despair, she looked at her situation, she recognized just a permission to herself, just a bit of hope, and then oscillated back to despair because there's no way she could think about it, only to regerminate and take forth after the death. And I can't explain how that happens, folks. I've just seen it happen. I've seen it where that which was before somehow springs forth, or even in the journey of caregiving, sometimes that happens, before the loved one has died, that this speck of whatever they're hopeful for in that emotion of what could change, because really that's what hope is a lot about, is the opportunity to change situations, right, or to make them different. That capacity to do that was what was important, not necessarily what it was. Oh, I wish I could converse with you folks. I wish we can have a engaging conversation. I'm not one for spitting out information, but I love the dialogue to challenge and to hash this out. I want to read something to you. This is by Kay Hirth, The Journey of Hope. A searching, if I may ask you as I read this, just look for the verbs, look for the actions, look for the movement. A searching for wholeness among our fractured parts. A coming to know who we are in new and unexpected ways. An exploring of our past and our present. A determination how adversity can enrich our meaning and purpose of life. A journeying inward to discover connections previously not understood between different mindsets, different emotions, different feelings within ourselves, or acknowledged. A discovering that the route to possible healing lies not only in the physical realm, but in the emotional, psychosocial, existential, spiritual realms. A coming to understand in our pain and suffering may lie the awareness of the preciousness of each day on this earth, and a possible discovering of our truth in this present moment of time and space. Again, I'll never forget this caregiver I was spending time with, is that her only hope was the fact that she could be in the here and now, not her mind moving forward, not her mind moving backward, but just in the here and now to be with her husband. This may come as no surprise. Some of the sources of hope I've found, it can be family, it can, but it also sometimes, that's because we're so, you sometimes can't choose your family, but sometimes you can, especially if you're living on the street. Sometimes family can foster our own perception of hope, but somehow it's so unique and individual. Oftentimes what we're hopeful for completely is missed. I find some of the best sources is friends, if they're fostering your autonomy and empowering you and holding space for you. And one of the best, actually, folks, is at Wellspring in their Caregiver Connects, where caregivers could come in an unconditional environment and talk about what they're hopeful for, where they will not be judged, will not be criticized, but what they're hopeful for would be held. And then we explore a little bit of what else is surrounding that sense of hope. Or sometimes when you explore grief, anticipatory grief, despair, sometimes then in and of itself, you find a speck of hope, or the person comes to their own understanding saying, I've explored all this emotion. I hoped I can get through it. I can see I can get through it. Some measures of spirituality and religion hold hope. I've seen, I've experienced, although I'm not really religious, but there's or would classify myself as spiritual. But there's a lot of aspects of those measures that can foster hope. There's some great literature, folks. One of the best books I ever read was by Dr. Bruce Perry called "The Boy That Was Raised by a Dog." It was amazing in terms of how people transcended um, um, struggles with life-limiting illness such as cancer, and not the separation, but the continuum from which they recognized some aspects of themselves as being hopeful, to how it germinated and fostered, and how it changed, and how it diluted and became smaller, and how it grew. It's just that oscillation, that movement was really powerful. One of the other books is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I've read many, many times. And I think the greatest source of hope, folks, that I've ever come across is hearing your stories, really hearing each other's stories, creating a sense of space to hold each other's stories. Part of the peer facilitated uh, model at Wellspring and here at Kensington is to hear other people's stories of caregivers and how they're navigating. And sometimes people draw strength and hope, or permission themselves to express what they're hopeful for. Even if they were to say this to somebody else, it would be seen as cruel or unpeaceful. Oh, that's all fancy. I didn't mean that to happen. Anyways, folks, I would love to know, you might, if you have time now, or just among yourselves, or, what does hope mean for you? Yes,
I've got a comment here I wanted to share with you.
sure.
Is it with hope so unstable? Can you speak to whether we are wise to build hope as fuel to get us through the enormous task of home-based caregiving for a vulnerable mom, especially during COVID? If so, please suggest ways to manufacture and nurture hope to help our caregiver mental health. Please and thank you.
I'm not going to be able to answer all that and give all the suggestions in 10 minutes, um, but I will speak to it. Judy, would it be possible if I did this with another group, if it's okay, she can have my email, and then I could provide more fulsome and more responsible suggestions to give something off the cuff, but I will answer it as best I can, high level, but I would love to help even more uh, on a one-on-one in terms of that. Does that be possible, Judy? Anyways, I will share my email. Well, see, what goes back to defining what you define as hope. I don't think hope can be fuel, right? I don't see hope as fuel. I don't see it as a momentum, necessarily as a momentum or as something to carry us forward. I see hope as a segue. I see hope as something to be held to explore other emotions that are associated with the hope. Do I think it's responsible or sort of to fuel hope? Well, it depends really what they're hopeful for. I don't necessarily how can I say, encourage and add fire and fuel to something what somebody's hopeful for. I explore what they mean by it. I explore what it carries, and how it manifests, and what perceptions are involved. And why I say that is because I've never come across hope that's singular, meaning this is what I'm hopeful for. Anytime I've sat and explored hope with a caregiver or an individual, living with cancer, there's all these other emotions that start to stir, that come up. That's what I find what's important. That's where the fuel, and not necessarily fuel, but that's where the meat of it is. So no, I don't necessarily add fuel to hope. So let's say, for example, especially with all that we're tasked now, I look at what somebody is hopeful for, recognize where it's coming from in terms of a lack, a grief, a loss, a despair, a perception, and then allow it to all kind of come to a sense of self-awareness and self-acknowledgement, if they have capacity to do so. And even in answering your question, I don't know the mother's condition. She could have early onset dementia. She can have cognitive impairment. She can have brain tumor. Like, there's so many pieces to this that depends. But I will share my email. You're more than welcome to contact me at Kensington. I'd be more than happy to provide the support in navigating that journey and answering those questions more fulsome.
Said thank you very much, and I've let them know we'll get back in touch with your email right after the
By all
session.
means, anybody, please. I mean, this is part of what we do here is build capacity, right? And our caregiver group at Wellspring has grown, and please, we're more than welcome to support you in any way we can. Especially now, and I'm so happy, just if I can speak to this a little bit more, Judy, is the fact that with COVID, it's really taxed us, right? So we have to use creative new um, ways of just navigating caregiving while in a pandemic and all that's encompassing. So we're looking at so many different creative ways. Just want to speak to this a little bit in Caregiver Bill of Rights, because sometimes the Bill of Rights can foster um, aspects of hope and all the emotions involved. As a caregiver for a loved one living with a life-limiting illness such as cancer, you have the right to care for yourself. And what I ask when I read this to you, I don't know if anybody has actually seen this. It's definitely at Wellspring, I'm sure. Just where hope can lie and what other emotions and polarities of that can interface with it. So um, to take care of yourself, that is not an act of selfishness. To seek help from others, such as Wellspring or Kensington, to recognize your limits, your endurance and strength, to maintain facets of your own life, which so often from caregivers I hear, I just wish I can do this. And now with COVID, a lot of those we can't do anymore, right? So the hope changes. Um, I have the right to get angry, depressed, happy, feel hopeful, not feel hopeful, express frustration, cry, to reject any unconscious or conscious attempts to be manipulated or morphed through guilt, anger, or depression, or more sensitively, not to have my emotions acknowledged and permissioned.
Rami, we have
Yep.
one of our members that would like to ask a question. I'm
Sure,
just,
yeah,
um,
by all means. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Yeah, by all means.
Anne, go ahead. Um, Sorry, I'm trying to unmute you, Anne, and for some reason it's not letting me.
There, am I unmuted?
No.
I guess, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Ann.
Yeah, I guess my question is a little bit around how do I give hope, I guess, to my husband, who I'm caregiver for, when there isn't, I mean, in the traditional definition of hope, it's not there, in terms of his, living for very long. But things like the skills he's losing, every now and then he'll say, well, I think I'll drive, well, I can take the car around the block. Well, he hasn't driven for a year and he won't be driving again. And I struggle with those things and I have talked to him about it. I said, I know this is very hard for you, but it's that type of care that I'm struggling with myself for him. Probably because I'm somehow feeling that I'm not giving him the satisfactory answer or the
Yes.
support around that I should be, but I don't know.
So if I can go, may I ask your husband's first name, Ann?
Doug.
Doug. So if we can go back just to your first thing you said, how can I give hope to him, right?
Yeah.
So may I ask you, what is your intention? Why do you want to give hope to him?
Well, I don't know whether it's hope I want to give to him as much as, and I don't mean resignation either, because I don't want, I want to give him, I guess, peacefulness with the way things are. He's an engineer. He compartmentalizes everything. So that's, that probably is helpful to some extent, because he doesn't do a lot of talking about his own illness, but it comes up with things like the routine tasks that he always used to do.
So if I may speak to that end, I've never been able in 30 years of end of life care and caregiving and bereavement, I've never been able to give somebody that. What I give them is a space and opportunity for them to be with that which they're losing. So the fact that, and I experienced this with my father, is the fact that he couldn't drive anymore. To hold a space and for the circumstances to set in and create an emotion, what I can give them is space for them to be with that emotion. But you can't really give him peace, right? It has to come within himself as he
Yeah.
faces that which he's going to lose. The peace, if it's possible, and sometimes it is, right, and oftentimes it's not. The peace is in being aware, processing, holding, permissioning the emotions associated with what they can't do anymore. You can't give them that. You know, the only way you could give it to them is to turn back the clock and let them drive again, right? Like, so that's the piece we talk a lot about in the work that we do is autonomy and self-direction, is to create the opportunity for him to be with the emotion of that which is going to be experienced as a result of him not being able to do what he used to do.
Okay.
There's a
Yeah.
lot more to
Yeah.
that end, I
Yeah.
think. And have you come to one of our sessions before?
Yes, I came to
Okay,
one
okay.
at Wellspring, and then the last one online I was participated in as
Yeah,
well.
I'd be happy to talk further about with you about it, but just want to bring, especially since we only got like 10 minutes, I'd love to talk to you more about it. But just to be like what I think to myself is that I don't have that power. As a caregiver, I can't give somebody peace. I can't give them hope, right? Um, and I'm speaking as a caregiver. What
Yeah.
I can give them is, opportunity to feel it, talk about it, recognizing, be aware of it, tell me how much they wish they still had it, tell me how it feels that they can't do it anymore, uh, respect their anger and depression about it, and loss and sense of loss of selfhood and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you. Yeah. I I would like to talk more about
Yeah, let's
this.
talk a little bit more, man.
Yeah.
Some of the strategies in
Yeah.
holding that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Rami, I just wanted to jump in. We have about 5 minutes left before we have to wrap up so that we can launch yoga next.
I hope to one day be able to do yoga. Excellent. So I just wanted to leave this with you folks. This is a Japanese healing practice. It's called kintsugi. And if you look, it's a bowl that breaks apart, like the fractured parts of our lives, especially as caregivers. And then we bring it back together, but it's still broken, right? However you define it. The cracks are still there, but we paint and illuminate the cracks in gold to signify that which has caused us trauma, loss, hurt, pain, are not necessarily in our own autonomy hidden, not necessarily from others, but even from ourselves, but they're illuminated so that we can see them, we could hold them. And from that, sometimes hope for other other expressions, other feelings, other I'm going to say it, other outcomes um, can be acknowledged, permissioned, and created. Um, in this work of caregiving folks, our bowls are broken many times, and um, the emotional expression, the feeling, the state that creates with us. My hope for you is just to be able to hold it, share it, bring it to a group, recognize a journal about it, because my passion is trauma, and I see when we don't necessarily always do that, it overwhelms our nervous systems, and that's what's called traumatization. It becomes too much for us to hold and carry, and on top of that, we are caregiving for somebody, and if they are going to live and die with the illness, then we might endure after that, and then we may not be in the best of well-being. So it's very important, the work that we're doing to support caregivers. It's very important for the work that is done at Wellspring. With the last few minutes, I want to read this from Barbara Kinsolver. Look, it's a poem that she wrote. She says, look, you might as well know this thing is going to take endless repair. Rubber bands, crazy glue, tapioca, the square of the hypotenuse. 19th century novels, heat strings, sunrise, all of these are useful. Also feathers. To keep it humming, sometimes you have to stand on the incline where everything looks possible. On the line you drew yourself, or in the grocery line making faces at a toddler secretly. I'd never do that in my mind as a male, over his mother's shoulder. You might you might have to pop the clutch and run. Who drives standard anymore? past all the evidence, past everyone who is laughing or praying for you. Definitely you don't want to go directly to jail as a Monopoly reference, but still here you go. Passing time, passing strange. Don't pass this up. In the worst of times, you will have to pass it off. Park it and fly by the seat of your pants. With nothing in the bank, you'll still want to take the express. Tiptoe past the dogs of the apocalypse that are sleeping in the shade of your future. Pay at the window. Pass your hope like a bad check. You might still have just enough time to make a deposit. That's what I have for you folks. I hope it helps. I didn't mean that. I really didn't mean that. But it's really just scratching the surface. I'd be happy, Judy will share my contact info of our program, and I'd be happy to be a support to you in any capacity, in any way, by Zoom, by phone, and maybe even one day in person. So please stay safe and take good care of yourselves. And hopefully, again, the pandemic will pass and we can get to a new normal. Certainly not going back to the old normal.